Hello and welcome to It's Your Time You're Wasting. And Glad you're with us to waste some more time this week. And we're looking,
Not so much of a waste of time this week. A bit more important, I think, Martin.
well, let's hope so. We're going to look at special needs and what is called the special needs crisis, or referred to sometimes as a special need crisis in schools. And we have some facts and figures and some opinions.
Not
And
you do. You've got facts and figures. I've
I've
got
got some.
opinions.
You've got opinions. I've got facts and
That's right.
figures, and perhaps
That's
something in
right.
between. We'll see. We'll see where
Yeah,
we
yeah.
go with this.
In between, I've got anecdotes and vibes, and you've got facts and science.
And
So
also,
between us,
you've got the possibility of having a sort of lagging problem with your camera
yeah,
and
I've been
things. It's
experiencing mysterious internet-related problems, special
Here we
internet-related
go.
problems. One might say, I know. Sorry. Can we caveat this episode by saying that we're going to try hard not to make jokes, but that doesn't come naturally.
Anyway,
Anyway,
on
so
that
Martin,
note,
start off by giving it paint a picture for us, Martin.
okay. So I've got two things to start us off with, and one is from Branwen Jeffries, who's the BBC education correspondent, and she was talking on a radio show the other day and talking about how special needs have increased in schools. So in 2017, 2.8% of children had a plan, and now 4.8% of children have a plan, and that's around
And when you say plan,
430,000 pupils.
you're talking about education healthcare plans there, aren't you?
Yes, those things.
EHCPs,
Yeah,
as they're commonly known to
yeah.
the denizens of schools.
And the biggest growing categories of people in those plans are SEMH, autism, ADHD, and 72% of the pupils are male.
Right. Right, which is something we're going to dig into a little bit, isn't it? So for anyone that isn't familiar with the acronyms that we use, just help us out a bit there, Martin. So SEMH,
Social, emotional, mental health.
right? ADHD,
Well, it's also ADD as well. So
there
attention,
is, and there's ODD.
yeah. So ADHD is attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder.
Yeah,
And autism we know about, but it's called now
sure.
ASD, so autism
Autism
spectrum
spectrum
disorder.
disorder.
Yeah.
Yep, yep, and that's important too. And we'll talk a little bit about why and how thinking of autism as being on a spectrum has really changed diagnosis over the years.
And I also
Okay,
want to mention about the level of the crisis in
yeah,
financial terms. And these comes from um, Tony Travers, who talks about the amount of funding for special needs. In 2019-20, it was around £6.5 billion. Sorry,
mhm.
let's say 2019-20, yes, it was 6.5 billion. It's now gone up to 11 billion pounds per
Which
annum.
kind of tracks, doesn't it? If the numbers with healthcare plans have almost doubled, and the funding requirements have almost doubled, that's not a huge mystery. But what's the question that we do need to think about is what's driving this. So the rising demand, we know the numbers of pupils who are being identified with SEND is shooting up. We know that many more families are seeking EHCPs, which, just for information, if you have an EHCP, that then introduces additional funding for your child, which then drives the provision for them in their school. And that funding has to be met by local authorities. So what's driving that demand, this rising demand, Martin?
Yeah, so it's difficult to say exactly, um, but there are various things out there that people are saying is causing it. One of those is that people are getting more likely to get diagnosis these days. So there are people actually, not just in school age children, but also adults who are applying to get diagnosis for various things, whether it be most notably ADHD and autism, I think.
So
Go on.
would you say then that the greater awareness that we have in the society, the fact that more of us use these terms and have an understanding of these terms, is driving people to go and find out, actually, maybe I have this?
It could be, and a lot of that could be driven by two things, one of which is the actual diagnosis has changed, and also then the awareness in the whole of society has changed as well. I'll
Exactly.
give
Yeah.
figures for this. This is from
Yeah.
Will Farr,
Please.
who's from the Cambridge University Faculty of Education. And he says in the last 24 years, there's been roughly a 780% increase in autism diagnosis.
780% increase. We need to. I don't know how good you are. I mean, obviously you've got them all written down, Martin. But holding these facts and figures in your mind might be tricky. We'll put them in the show notes so that if you want to refer back, you can do 780% increase over what time period again?
24 years.
24 years. So 24 years ago, when we were diagnosing autism, were we looking for the same things?
And this is where people would say, well, back in the 70s,
Yeah,
profound autism was what we now call
yeah,
profound autism. So
yeah.
possibly non-verbal,
Mm,
low IQ would be one of the
yeah,
ways of diagnosing it. Almost entirely male. Um, and what Will Farr says, what has happened is that we have broadened the category. And a
yeah,
lot of that work was done by Lorna Wing in the 70s, who wanted to broaden it to ensure that families got more help, because there was a lot of families who weren't getting any help because their child didn't sort of
yeah, yeah.
fit the
And I think
pattern as decided what was autism in those
the
days. Yeah.
first time I ever encountered the term was watching Rain Man.
Yeah.
And I think that coloured public perceptions for some years, didn't it? The idea of the character that Dustin Hoffman portrays in that movie, of the idiot savant, that someone who has no real ability to cope with social situations, but had an incredible numerical ability. And there's stories of people with incredible artistic abilities who have those characteristics. And I think it might be fair to say that obviously that exists within autistic spectrum disorder, but it is by no means typical or probably helpful in thinking about many of the young people who are receiving ASD diagnoses.
Yeah, there is, with the spectrum, if you like, there's people on one side who saying it's a profound disability and very difficult to live in the day to day if you have it,
Sure.
or have to seek, pretty full-time caring to look after people in that state. And then there's people at the other end of the spectrum who are saying it's my superpower, and whether it be
Yeah,
ADHD or autism or
yeah,
whatever.
which is really
And
interesting.
mm,
It's a really interesting take, isn't it? So people say that there's even arguments made for that around conditions like dyslexia, isn't it? That there are people who consider there to be advantages as well as
mm.
disadvantages
and of
to
course that
those.
there indeed might be, and we could get into that. The what Will Farr refers to as the category changing over the years, he talks about it's lost the meaning it used to have. There's
Mm,
been a doubling of people being referred over the last 5 years.
yeah,
So ASD in 2015 to 2019 in England, they reckon it was 1 to 2% of the population.
yeah,
In America and Japan, it's currently 3% of the population.
yeah.
And
And it's expected to rise to that
he
here in the
thinks it
UK,
will
isn't it?
go to the same numbers here.
Yeah,
Um, the WHO reckons 1% of the world population has it, but there are estimates that 50% of or more people remain undiagnosed. So none of these figures are really tight. And also, it's very difficult now to say where the spectrum goes to, because people aren't sure
Yeah.
exactly where the line should be drawn. And this is
Shall
something
we?
Richard Dawkins calls the discontinuous mind here, that we have when we get to a spectrum, it can be quite long. And where do you draw the line saying, well, that's autism and that isn't,
Mm.
can sometimes be very difficult. But there are people who think we are
No.
overdiagnosing.
You're right,
Um,
and it's something that increasingly I find people sort of introduce into casual conversations where, if you say something in a particular way, people will go, "Oh, that's a bit autistic." It's
hmm,
become, and I don't think there's any intent there to demean or ridicule or anything like that. It's just become part of our descriptive vocabulary for thinking about a set of approaches. But we'll get it. Let's come back to autism in a moment, because we've got lots to say about autism, and let's just think a little bit more about the SEND crisis in general. So we've got this rising demand. We've got funding shortfalls that are happening at the same time. The big problem here is that local authorities just don't have the cash. And there have been various parts of the country where they have issued diktat saying no more diagnoses of. And so that has prompted parents who can afford it to get private diagnoses. A little bit of a cynical sidebar there, that typically anybody who pays for a diagnosis of anything is more likely to get it. And that is in no way saying that that these things don't exist or they're not real. But if there's a cash transaction taking place, that does colour what's going on. There's all sorts of delays and legal battles that families are experiencing, where they feel embattled. They feel that they're set in this confrontational relationship with, perhaps with a school or with a local authority, and all of that's
yeah,
creating
can we?
all sorts of difficulties, isn't it?
It's causing difficulties. I mean, there's also things like the amount of time it takes to get a diagnosis for the vast majority of people,
Right.
which is, you know, very long indeed. Where I live in southeast London, there's about a 3-year waiting list for autism ADHD diagnoses. They brought in a private company to clear backlogs, and it
Mm.
did start to sweep up quite a lot. But also at the height of the problem, they actually got them to do ADHD and autism diagnoses at the same time, which seems to me
Right.
very sensible, actually, to do those
Yeah.
things. It was all
Yeah.
done online as well, so
Yeah.
with still quite focused on interviews and forms that teachers and parents and other people had to fill in, and of course the child themselves. There is, a huge discrepancy over the country. I mean, I know in
Yeah.
Oxfordshire at some point, for autism diagnoses for adults, which is also increasing,
Yes, it is.
was
Yeah.
16 years waiting list recently. I mean,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
ludicrous.
Yeah. So it's no
But
wonder that people are going to pay for a diagnosis if that speeds
yeah,
up a
and I
process.
think we have to be careful about saying that some companies who are doing it might be giving up too many diagnoses because they're getting money for it. I think there's some companies are more scrupulous than others, perhaps, and we don't
Yeah,
actually know
and
the figures.
yeah, but it's just something.
I'm
It's a
thinking of being sued there, or not being sued. And now we've lost David for a bit, so we'll see if he decides to come back in. As you can see, he's in mid expression there. He's come back. There we go. You've come back, David. You've been away. No, he's still he's still gone. So I'll go through some of the things we have on diagnoses and other issues that perhaps we need to look at carefully. Here he is. He's back.
I'm very sorry. I don't
It's
know
all
what
right.
happened.
You,
It's all us. Where were we? Because suddenly your face sort of went into a rictus, and I realised that either uh, the Wi-Fi had frozen, or you'd had a stroke, and luckily you're fine.
Yeah, well, it could be both, of course. If I
It
did
could have
have a
been.
stroke at that moment, who would have saved me? You just think it's
Right. So kick
um,
us off. Where have we got to? Sorry, apologies,
so. Yeah,
everyone.
so we're looking at the diagnosis crisis, if you like, as well, saying that there's the 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 amount of time people are waiting for diagnoses and these
Yeah.
things.
And
So there's
and the
something
strain
down
that's
the line
placed.
where more diagnoses are going to happen. Just on the figures we
uh,
gave, if we're going from 1% to 3% of the population, that's going to be an increase, and that's just in autism.
mm,
Um, the other thing, of course, is that when these diagnoses come through, then schools are expected to provide
right.
for them.
And
And this
with
is where
the
the £11 billion. Can I just say that £11 billion that comes out of the school budget is not even up at £50 billion. So to go from 6.5 billion over the last 5 years, basically to 11 billion, and not increase funding at all for it,
yeah,
it's you can see
it's a
why
problem.
it's causing problems.
It's a problem. The system's creaking at the seams. There's all sorts. The schools cannot cope with the increase in demand. There's a shortage of professionals involved. We've got a shortage of EPs, educational psychologists, Senkos, the special educational needs coordinators within the schools are struggling. It's difficult to get even teaching assistants in schools now. When the amount that they can be paid by school is less than they're going to be paid in a supermarket. It's just getting the bodies on the ground to put in the support is a huge problem, and I think teachers also reporting low confidence, insufficient training, not really being sure what to do to support some students. The
Yeah.
increase in students with these diagnoses. And I think one of the things which I often find myself saying is that if we teach in ways which are beneficial to children who have special needs. So if you're autistic, you're likely to benefit from really predictable um, routines. So is every other human being. If you're um, have a ADHD, you're likely to benefit from having information chunked up and not being given too much information about anything at any one time. So's everyone else. Everyone's going to benefit from that. If you're, the ways in which we teach to meet the needs of those who have special educational needs diagnosis actually correspond quite closely with the ways which it's maybe most effective to teach everybody.
Yeah, but we also have, since lockdowns, since
Mm,
COVID, we've got a missing number of perhaps 1 million children who've gone missing out of the system, who are regularly not attending school. A lot of these children are those who find schools to be overwhelming. Now,
yeah,
schools isn't just teaching. Schools is, it's architecture.
yes,
It's
yeah,
people swirling around these things. And you look at a lot of modern schools, they have big areas where there must be, quite a bit of noise and traffic going through. Our schools designed in a way to allow people who are sensitive to light, are sensitive to noise. The teacher might be great in the classroom, but getting
yeah,
to the classroom is is
yeah.
quite a journey for
It's
some people.
fraught. Yeah. I think, and again, I think that experience in a big secondary school, the disorientation and the anxiety produced by those things is likely to be felt by a majority of 11-year-olds attending that school for the first time. It's not a situation that's reserved for the most vulnerable. And if we try to align what we're doing in schools to consider the needs of the most vulnerable. Everybody benefits, but it's an asymmetric benefit. The most vulnerable perhaps benefit most.
Yeah, but we're still talking. I mean, still talking about schools what we can do within schools rather than the lighting. fluorescent
Right.
lighting,
Yeah. So
things like that,
the
which,
lighting is something that we can have some agency and control
well, we
over, unless
can in
you're
some
one of
schools,
those
and some
BH
schools we can't.
building
You've
schools of the
got
future schools
PFI,
where, yeah, they've got contractors.
you've got PFI schools
Yeah.
that you don't even manage.
Yeah.
You're in that
So
school.
PFI schools are a real particular problem, and luckily that is not the majority of schools by
No.
a long shot.
And also quiet areas. And I think
Yeah.
people who are expert in mental health and special needs, actually, this is where the funding comes in, of course. Um, it's promised that every school is going to have a mental health expert in there. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if that's going to happen or how long
It's
it's
going
going
to
to
need a lot
take.
of
But
it's going to need a
but
lot
the
of money
way,
to make it happen.
and it's going to cost, and it's also going to, if it's one person per school, the way things are looking in a big secondary school, they're going to be inundated,
Yeah. They
inundated.
are. Yeah, they are.
You
No,
know,
absolutely. In the way that the people who are already staffing schools who have responsibility in these areas are already inundated,
yeah,
and that results in not just anxiety of students and not just attendance issues, but all kinds of safeguarding related issues, which crop up as a result of these things. So we've got this creaking system that a lot of the solutions lie outside of the control and the agency of schools themselves. We'll come back at the end to talk a little bit about some of the things which schools might be able to do.
mm,
But there's no doubt that we're in a political climate where there isn't a lot of money for anything. That that education is one of just many areas that is crying out for increased funding. And although money is not a magic wand, it is definitely going to be part of the issue that we've been asked now for over a decade to do more with less every year, and that's becoming increasingly difficult for everyone concerned, and the system becomes degraded physically, and the resilience that we have as in terms of human capital becomes degraded as a result of this under investment. But we can't control that. We can't do anything about that directly. But as I say, we'll return to that. Let's talk about autism in a bit more detail, Martin. So
yeah.
I know that you gave us a good. It's Autism Awareness Month right now.
It's autism. It's called variously Acceptance or Awareness Month, but April
Right.
is Autism Acceptance Month. Yes, so it's quite suitable that we're talking about that today.
Can we talk a little bit about, Martin, the concept of both under and over
Right.
diagnosis
So
autism?
yeah, I mean, this lovely book. It's worth a look at, which I will show for those on YouTube. Be able to see
The
it here.
age of diagnosis.
It's
Who's
The
it
Age of
by, Martin?
Diagnosis. Yeah, by Susan O'Sullivan.
Right.
Suzanne O'Sullivan. So she talks that about overdiagnosis and wants to emphasize that overdiagnosis is not the same thing as misdiagnosis.
Right.
She is not saying that people diagnosed with ADHD or autism, and in the book it goes into cancer as well and various other things. So it covers a wide range of ailments, long COVID, other things.
Yeah.
She's not saying that people do not have these traits or these illnesses
Conditions
or
or yeah.
whatever, these conditions. She's not saying it doesn't happen. What
No.
she's saying is, in terms of overdiagnosis, is the diagnosis you've received useful to you and useful to us as a society as well, if you like? So if you receive, and she says many of the people who receive diagnoses of ADHD and autism are thankful for that diagnosis. So we have to emphasize that a lot of people are saying that explains so much about
Yeah.
the way I am.
Yeah.
Now, at at the ends of the far end of what was called profound autism, this has been going on a long time that people have had this diagnosis, but it's at the
Yeah.
milder end that we're not sure where to draw that line. I was talking about the
No.
discontinuous mind and all that, the wanting to draw a hard and
Yeah.
fast line, but actually you can't draw a hard and fast line between that.
So if I've got this right, Martin, what you're saying is that we're diagnosing correctly people with autism, but there's not much we can do with that diagnosis beyond be grateful that it's taken place.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's things we're expected to do. Um, and she does point out that in some cases, and could be a very small percentage, but some people who receive a diagnosis then lean on that diagnosis as a crutch, if you like, that they identify as
Yeah.
autistic and perhaps become less able to take part in society as they might have done before without the diagnosis. But we also have to get into there about masking and other things there. So
Yeah.
I think that is, it's a difficult thing to talk about. She does say this, and I love this line: diagnosis is first and foremost a clinical art. The line between good health, illness, and disease is often blurred.
Right.
And that's
It's
about
not a
drawing that
science,
line.
it's an art. She's
She's saying
suggesting.
that, yeah, and she's a clinician,
Right.
so she's
Yeah.
involved in doing. She's not a journalist talking about this. She's saying from it is an art. It's not something this hard science.
Yeah.
Diagnosis, medicinal diagnosis, is something which is
Yeah.
not exact.
No, and I think one of the things that which listeners, viewers might have come across, might have encountered, is that as we've become more aware of autism or ASD as a thing that exists out in the world, we're all amateur we're all making our own uninformed amateur diagnoses all the time, and I think it's become pretty normal for saying, "Oh, is that student maybe ASD?" And for colleagues to be going, "Yeah, probably a bit," that kind of thing. And there are various stereotypical behaviours that we tend to associate with ASD, such as um, finding it hard to respond to social situations. Traditionally there was a stereotypes like fascination with trains, and all of these things. And this is something I find really fascinating. Tend to be associated with boys. And so
Right.
the other side of the diagnosis issue is this idea of underdiagnosis. And you told us at the start of the show, I think I'm right, that 72% of diagnoses are male.
Yeah. So
So that might be because more boys than girls have autism, or it might be we're not very good at diagnosing girls. And I've got a
I
particular stake in that.
I think so. I think there's a book out by Gina Rippon, who's a neuroscientist, and the book is called "The Lost Girls of Autism."
Yeah,
And she points out in that book that the female autistic brain is different than the male one. Yet
yeah,
what we've been doing over the years is talking about autism as though it's the classical male
exactly.
brain, the
Exactly.
extreme male brain, if you like. Um,
So,
she she points out that that teachers actually are prone to that gender bias
mm,
themselves, and she points to tests they've done with showing two people with similar autistic traits, but giving them different names. So Jack, or
sure.
and
Yeah,
the teachers will always say Jack is the one
yeah,
with
yeah,
autism and
yeah,
Jane is the one without it. So as many as 80% of girls remain undiagnosed by the age of 18. So schools are quite good at picking up boys, perhaps, or suggesting to parents that the
or
child might have autism, but
society
with
more widely.
females, not
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, so I've got a particular stake in this. So my youngest daughter experienced some mental health issues. We were referred to CAMS, and in the first meeting, as parents, we were asked, "Have you ever considered that she might be autistic?" And I sort of scoffed and went, "No, obviously not. She doesn't fit any of those preconceived stereotypes that I was talking about earlier." And I was absolutely as guilty as anyone, as everyone, of those gender biases. and I had no idea that autism, as a teacher, as a very, someone who's been teaching for a long time, working in education for a long time, no idea that autism in girls was so different. And it turns out that she now has her autism diagnosis, and when that first was being explored, she was absolutely one of those people who said, this is really helpful. This helps explain why I respond the way I do, why I feel the way I do, and she's found it very useful. She's at university now, and she's entitled to various considerations, none of which she's wanted, but the fact that those exist as things which she could tap into if she wanted to, is a reassurance, is a helpful thing. But yeah, no, I was profoundly shocked at my own ignorance.
Mm.
So maybe it'd be helpful to say a little bit about how autism presents differently in girls.
Yeah. So, bearing in mind, this is from a sort of neuroscientist talking about this. She talks about how autistic girls have higher brain activity in areas associated with social reward, greater connectivity in key social brain networks, and a propensity to monitor and control powerful aversive responses to loud noises and bright lights, etc. Whereas boys might externalize those things, girls will tend to be going inwards. Their
Yeah,
lower scores on autism tests for measures of social dysfunction doesn't mean they have milder difficulties, and
no,
this is important. Rather, they employ masking or camouflaging techniques, which is associated then with higher levels of anxiety,
right,
exhaustion, and stress, linking to depression, sometimes suicidal ideation, and also self-harm. So the way
yeah,
that you might say, oh, she's very anxious, that child,
yeah,
or she's always stressed, these sorts of things might be signals.
yeah. So the stereotype is that boys act out, whereas girls turn in.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
they think that at the moment there's a 4-to-1 ratio male to female, but they actually think, or this researcher particularly thinks, that it may be more like 1-to-1.
yeah, very, very possibly. When we think about the female students that we've all taught, who fit that definition and fit that set of descriptions much higher, than, or at least probably as likely as the boys that fit that sort of stereotypical um, view paradigm of what it is to be autistic. I remember, just to sort of just to slip into anecdote for a moment, years ago, I taught a boy who had an autistic diagnosis, and I found him. This was, some time ago, and I found him really interesting because he defied some of my expectations. He was very able, but he was also very good at English. He was really good at things like poetry analysis, and he wrote his own poetry. So he wasn't sort of the way you'd expect an autistic boy to necessarily present. And anyway, I was his English teacher, and we had a speaker come and visit the school and give a talk to the students. And one of the things they said to them was that the most important master skill for adult life was to be empathetic. And he came to see me afterwards and said, "Look, I just can't do empathy. That I don't, that's part of my condition." And we had a very interesting, because that he was interested. I went away and sort of did a bit of reading, and I said, "If would you like me to have a go at teaching you how to almost fake empathy, to have a sort of cognitive awareness of what other people are doing instinctively when they're being empathetic?" And we went through all sorts of things like teaching the emotions associated with facial expressions, and I remember particularly him saying to me, "Oh my God, does it mean that when somebody looks like that, they feel this?"
Mm.
And and when I was saying, "Yeah, typically it does mean that," he was, "Oh, I wish someone had told me that before. It would have saved a lot of grief." because and there's something sort of interesting here that we schools are orientated and aligned to teach academic knowledge and the social skills we assume we think people pick up from their environments, but that might not be true for all students. That there might be a significant subset of children for whom it might be really beneficial to explicitly teach some of these things. I was doing a pretty amateur job with one child, but maybe more programs, more greater awareness along those kinds of lines, that there are things that you can learn and then knowingly apply that most of us maybe take for granted to
There's also
greater.
things like cognitive behavior therapy, and
Yeah,
and again, we're talking about, is there the provision for that for so
sure.
many
Yeah, we are.
children
Yeah, we
who
are.
might need it. It's interesting that there was work coming up to 2020 where they were doing brain scans and looking at what the differences might be between an autistic person and a non-autistic person,
Mm.
um, and they thought they'd come up with it, um, in terms of connectivity pathways in social brain networks in particular, in the striatum, and I don't know
Oh,
what that
right.
is, the
Where's that,
striatum
Martin?
structure,
The striatum.
involved with reward and reinforcement, the neural correlates of autism. They were pretty confident in 2020 that they'd found it. Now, the problem is they were focusing, 70% of the studies focused only on male brains.
Ah,
Um, one or two of the others had included one or two female brains. Overall, of the 4,000 autistic participants studied, under 10% were female.
right. Okay, that's interesting.
So they're thinking this is blown out of the water. So it's only recognizable through behavior. There's no biomarkers for autism
Well,
as
no,
as
it's
currently
interesting. So it's
as currently diagnosed.
there's also research that's gone into the genetic correlates between autism and genes showing up, and so various genes have been implicated. If you're interested, there's one called CHD8, responsible for chromatin remodeling. So that's implicated and connected with autism. There's
Okay, so what she says, and sorry, Gina Rippon says about that, there's genetic studies indicate multiple differences in brain development between
yeah,
autistic and non-autistic brains. There is still currently no biomarker for it. It clearly runs in families. It's
yeah,
40 to 90% I can't even say the word,
yeah,
heritable.
yeah. It
Um,
is. It's a hard one to say, heritable. So yeah, and we know that it's far too simplistic to say that the single genes which are doing the causing these effects, that autism would be polygenic, which means there will be hundreds, perhaps thousands of genes in combination acting to produce some of these. But it's interesting that we have identified some genes which we think are connected, and we're a long way off
hmm.
from being able to do perhaps anything useful with that. It's more of a post hoc analysis and going, oh yeah, okay, that yeah, we've identified someone who's autistic, and oh look, it turns out that we've identified this gene also.
I've also got there's some correlates. So these are just correlations, but there's a higher risk of um, autism in if you're hypermobile. So there's a higher likelihood of autism if you're
What's
hypermobile.
hypermobility, Martin? What does
So
that
what
mean?
used to be called double jointedness,
Yeah,
and if you're double jointed in a number of places, higher
yeah,
numbers, you even get different levels of hypermobility.
that's
Um,
wild. Any plausible reason why that might
well,
be?
that might be no, the connectivity. So if
Mm,
you can push your little finger back a long way,
yeah,
you're obviously something there about the connectivity of the joints,
of the
and whatever that
tissues.
is. I haven't looked into this in huge detail,
Okay, Are you
But
speculating there,
but you could
Martin?
say that there's something going on there physically. There is something
Yeah,
physical
because
that's there.
epilepsy's a correlate as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and also gastrointestinal issues, particularly in
Really,
girls, particularly in
really.
girls. And funnily enough, older fathers, there's
Yeah,
a
older
correlate. If you've got
fathers.
an older
Okay,
father, not the mother, but the father's older, there's more
you're
of a
an older
chance of it.
father, aren't you?
You're not as young as you used to be.
No,
Um,
I was a young father when I had my children.
and also,
You're not,
and
yeah,
there's
sorry.
one allergy that pops up as well more than others, and that is an allergy to egg white.
Egg white. And we have to be really, really careful with these correlations, don't you?
Yeah,
Because
they're
obviously,
correlations.
yeah, there are correlations. Correlation for clarity is not causation. And there's some if you do an internet search on amusing correlations, and you can find some great examples. Like I think one of my favorite is that the global warming is correlates very or matches really really well with incidences of international piracy. So
Yeah,
clearly, pirates cause global warming is a fun thing to entertain. But the serious point here is that there are various people who claim that autism is caused through inoculation, for immunization, and that has a lot of people really scared. And a lot of childhood illnesses, which we'd pretty much done away with, have been resurging because anxious parents, parents who have been scared into thinking that maybe inoculating their child against MMR or something like that might cause them to become autistic.
yeah. It was something actually published in the Lancet, and I've forgotten
Yeah, no,
who wrote the thing,
let's
but
not
he
let's not
became
credit that.
completely and utterly discredited.
Well, now
Um,
he got struck off, and now he's
yeah.
in the States
Well,
selling it
over in
all
the
again.
States, they have a different problem, which is the Kennedy problem, and
Yeah,
they're actually doing a survey now, or tracking. I think the idea of autism and autistic people there are running scared. Where does this end up? You know, what are
yeah,
they
no,
trying to say?
absolutely. And the reason this correlation sort of emerged is that our ability to diagnose autism sort of it, it becomes children are they show the symptoms at the same age that we might immunize them, and
Mm.
so that there
Well,
is a yeah, so
that
silly
was
to
when
think.
autism was, thought to be there's different levels of autistic diagnosis. I mean, the first level I think was 18 months
Yeah.
was the time that then it became 4 or 5.
Mm.
Now it can be a lifelong thing. I mean, this thing,
Absolutely, and lots of
and
adults, as we've talked about, being diagnosed.
well, they're finding their children are diagnosed, and then they're saying, "Well,
Yeah,
hang on, you've got those." The parents look at each other and say, well, "You're," and you
yeah,
should go and get. Well, no, you should go. So getting themselves diagnosed, which is adding to the numbers of people waiting and clogging up the system to some extent. I'm not blaming them for that. The system should be there to
it
take
absolutely should.
take advantage of this moment, really, and it's not doing it. Um, ADHD also
Yeah,
has a few crossover symptoms with, you do a Venn diagram of ADHD and autism, there's quite a lot in the middle there. Um, and quite a few girls have been diagnosed for both, in fact. And what is a new term coming through, which is AUDHD, AUDHD, which
hmm,
it's not a diagnostic term at all, but some people saying I am ADHD or whatever. I mean,
yeah, yeah. I mean, the big difference, I think, in being diagnosed with autism and being diagnosed with ADHD is that people who have an ADHD diagnosis are often offered medication. So again, straying into anecdote, the first time I became aware of ADHD really as a teacher was a student that I taught many years ago who was a lovely little boy, came in, worked hard, very pleasant, and one day erupted in the class, threw stuff around, was a typhoon of destruction. and whirled out of the classroom again. And I was absolutely stunned. And I was saying, "Blimey, what's wrong with him today?" And one of his classmates said, "Oh, he hasn't taken his meds, sir." And and I was absolutely flabbergasted with the difference. It was night and day. And anyone who says or is skeptical that ADHD exists and is skeptical of the effects of medication should meet children who are on and off their meds. And I think that one of the things about ADHD meds, Ritalin, which is a form of amphetamine, is that it sort of creates the ability to concentrate, which would be beneficial to potentially to anyone who took it. But again, it has this asymmetric benefit for people that really struggle to focus and concentrate.
Mm.
And but the medication, there is no medication, not that there should be, but there is no medication for autism, but there is for ADHD, and that changes how it's perceived, the way we interact with it.
Yeah, I think, and in terms of whether people on the milder end of the ADHD spectrum should be offered medication straight away as the first thing. Often the private companies will offer ADHD medication straight away rather
Mm.
than any form of therapy or that, again, for obvious reasons, that there is so much strain on the system that
And I
they
think
do that.
one of the things that you were saying earlier about sometimes these labels, these diagnoses, then become a crutch for some of the people who are given them. And I do remember, again, a different child that I taught who was more along those sorts of lines, that he would behave very, very badly at various points in school, and then when challenged, say, "Oh, well, it's my ADHD." And then, I remember on one occasion saying to him, "How come you behave well in my classroom?" And he said, "Well, you're all right."
You're
And
doing
and
that thing. You're doing that teacher thing. They're all right for me.
Yeah, yeah, I know. Well, he was saying he was doing the thing. He was, but I remember he kept, because he had nominated me as the safe place to go if he got into trouble. So he often used to sort of pop up in my classroom and just sit at the back and get on with his whatever he was meant to be doing quietly without causing a problem. And I remember on one occasion, I think it was his French teacher, sort of followed him in, and she was furious. I can't remember what he'd done, some sort of atrocity. And she was really, really angry. And she said, something needs to be done. And I was, okay, I am actually teaching a lesson, right?
Mm,
So he went to the back, and I said to him afterwards, like, why did you do that? And he said, I don't know, it's just my ADHD.
mm,
And I said to him at that point, but how come you never do things like that when you come into my room?
mm,
And he was making choices. Now,
mm.
I don't for a moment want to suggest that those choices perhaps weren't harder for him to make, that he perhaps had less sense of control over his behavior, but he was absolutely making choices about where he felt it was
Yeah,
appropriate and inappropriate.
yeah, and we need to be careful about this
We do.
because some people with more extreme uh,
Yeah.
versions of ADHD and autism obviously do not have much choice in what they do, and all the way through. In fact, you could
Yeah.
say that there is different ways of dealing with it. But this is the argument that Suzanne O'Sullivan is making, just at
Yeah.
the milder end. How far do we need to go down the milder end of diagnosis? And
Is
then
it
people
helpful
using
to
it
be
as a
told you
as a
have an
crutch, yeah,
excuse?
and
Yeah.
that
No,
and
it's
changing their
interesting.
behaviour or whatever they do. And by all means, that she doesn't mean everyone who's at the milder end of the spectrum does that by any means.
Yeah.
Um, and
No, of
also,
course not. Of
no,
course not. And the vast majority don't.
yeah, and in terms of the diagnosis of ADHD, it's something that there's a lot more suspicion of, I think,
Yeah, probably.
because there's this thing about adults, comedians particularly, or people in public
Comedian.
life have been saying, "Oh, I've got ADHD, I've got this diagnosis," etc., etc. But
Yeah,
Ken Robinson, funnily enough, was one of the first to point out some sort of doubt about ADHD. And I remember him
yeah, he
doing
wasn't.
a talk with a map of
Yeah,
America.
there's one of his TED talks, the less famous of his TED talks. Yeah, he has a map of the United States, and he shows incidences of diagnoses which are far more prevalent on the East Coast than on the West Coast of the States. And then he sort of shows it spreading like a plague, doesn't he?
Yeah, across
So
America. Yeah,
and 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 this speaks to one of the points that we were saying earlier, that when we have a sense of what something might be, when we have a set of us that a set of symptoms might be associated with the condition, then we can diagnose it, and if we don't know those things, then we can't.
yeah, and because those things have changed, then it's more difficult for us who aren't in the know, so to speak. So there is a need, I think, in schools particularly, that people are kept aware of what the diagnoses are and why, and the thinking behind it, to try and say, look, this is not mumbo jumbo. There are things going on here,
Yeah.
but yes, there are elements of doubt, and that's because of this, that, and the other. This is to try and explain it's not an exact science, I think,
Right.
is quite important as well.
Okay, and that takes us, I think, to the promise that we made near the beginning, that we'd talk a little bit about what can schools do, what should teachers be aware of. So, in terms of building whole school understanding within, what are the sorts of things that all staff, not just Senkos, what do all teachers and all staff who work in schools need to know? Do you think, Martin?
Well, I think they need to know in the first instance that just because someone's not diagnosed doesn't mean they haven't
Right.
they're not autistic or ADHD or whatever. There are things that you have to take into account, that there are unmet needs.
Yeah, yeah, and just but also the opposite of that, just because they fit with your kind of expectations about what a condition might be, doesn't mean they have it.
Yeah, you might have the wrong end of the stick about what that is anyway.
Yeah,
You might think this is what autistic looks like, and
right. Yeah,
you also
like
might.
like me with my lack of understanding about girls' autism. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. Is there a danger, Martin, that if we train teachers in neurodiversity, trauma-informed practice, autism, ADHD, all of those things, that they start to behave like amateur clinicians?
I think that there's an issue with that, in that because of the lack of support around this area,
Yeah.
that it's not necessarily the teacher acting like that, it's society pushing the teacher to be the first line of
It's almost
of
like schools have to triage
yeah.
for neurodiversity. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So we mentioned about the how hard it can be for some students to just physically navigate the geography of school. Are there things, so we talked about lighting and PFI schools not being able to do anything about that, but thinking about a teacher in their own classroom, there are various things that maybe they can do in their own classroom.
Yeah, I mean, again, it might be things that you, in terms of setting work, hard deadlines, using stress as a way to get kids through, to put a little bit of exam stress, or the exams are coming up, you've got to do this, that, and the other. All those things that we use as
Yeah,
motivational,
yeah, 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 yeah.
actually, there's, for some kids, that is motivational. For other kids, it might be having the exact opposite effect.
Yeah, it's interesting that the effects of stress seem to follow an inverse U, in that you need a little bit of stress in order to do anything. Otherwise, you just stay in bed. But that tips over at a certain point and becomes debilitating. And so, finding that sweet spot for every individual in a classroom, very, very difficult.
Yeah,
But something to be aware of, something that what you think might be motivating could be crippling for someone.
yeah.
And so be mindful and careful about that. What do you think about people who say, Let's let certain kids have fidget toys to manage their anxiety.
It's funny. I've been doing this. I just I said, "What? It just fell off the pen, and I've been playing with it."
Right, right.
So perhaps it's a good thing. I remember when I was at school,
Yeah.
I was doodling in the back of my French book, and I got told off big time by the teacher for doodling in class. And he humiliated me in front of everyone, and he held up my doodle and trashed it and all sorts of things. Why was I doodling? Perhaps there's something going on there, and I'm using
Well,
this thing now.
doodling's an interesting one because there's a body of evidence which says that doodling really can improve focus
Yeah,
and memory and sustained attention.
yeah,
So there's various studies that have looked into that. But where that tips is if doodling becomes drawing.
yeah.
So if you're
Well, here we go.
concentrating.
Where's the line drawn again? You see, we're into that
Yeah, yeah. No, if
discontinuous
you're
brain stuff.
concentrating on sort of putting together a but if you're idly drawing and using it as an aid to focus in on what's being discussed or what you're meant to be attending to, then it can be a benefit. And
Yeah,
so, maybe that's something teachers need to be mindful of. There was a vogue a few years ago for quite sort of noisy, obtrusive fidget spinners
yeah,
and things like that. And I think that they have largely been shown to be maybe not a great idea. I know that in a lot of primary schools that children are told that they can have a fidget toy as long as nobody else can see it and as long as it doesn't disrupt.
mm,
So having a bit of blue tack under the table is not disruptive. So your fidget toy didn't disrupt me at all, Martin. I
that's
wasn't
good.
aware of
That's
you
good news.
fiddling. No, so that's a good fidget toy. So maybe being mindful that something that isn't distracting for the majority, for everyone else, isn't causing any problem. We should let children have those props if they feel they need them.
Yeah, and every
Um,
child is different. Just because you have
right.
autism or ADHD or dyspraxia or whatever, you're not the same as everyone else who has that
No,
condition.
no, but I do think going back to something I was saying earlier that pretty much all human beings benefit from having consistency in routines and expectations, and so deliberately leaning into being clear and consistent is going to benefit all of the students that you teach, but particularly those that are most anxious.
Yeah, but we are definitely doing something wrong in this country with 1 million children or so. I think Rachel D'Souza has come up with that number, the Children's Commissioner, saying that there is this number of kids who are not regularly attending school, though some are coming back now.
It's
There's
not just this
also
country, is it, Martin?
it's
That's an
also well,
international issue.
it, in this country it seems to be more, but
Okay,
and particularly those who've left school as well, in terms of the number of people after the lockdowns and everything. There was a high number of people who had opted out of the workplace and things like that.
right.
Young people. Now, in most other countries, in fact, I think all countries in the developed world, that has now gone back to pre-pandemic levels, except this country. And we
Really?
have a higher number of young people out of work than any other advanced country, and they are claiming, in the main, mental health issues. So there
Right.
is something going on here that is different to other countries.
Okay. All right. Well, that's any sense of what I'm just looking at a couple of stats here. So, um, as of 2023, globally, 244 million children were out of school, a decline of nearly 40% from 10 years before. And that's interesting. Interesting that maybe unsurprisingly, sub-Saharan Africa faces really the most significant challenges internationally, with 50% now
Yeah, I
of
think we have
adolescents
to we
not
have to
attending
compare
school.
like with like. I mean, in terms of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
developed
But that's a
countries. Yeah.
change. That's a change over the last few years.
Mm.
So you're right, but all of those things are interesting. I'd be. Is there any speculation, Martin, as to why people think that things are starker in the UK than elsewhere?
There's a lot of people saying what it might be. I don't think people know
Right.
strongly enough to make the
Okay.
great sort of this is what we do about it, let alone this is what it
Yeah.
is. I don't think they got to that point, but the numbers are pretty stark, I think, which is part of
Um,
what they're trying to do, as the government are trying to do
yeah.
with the PIP payment and things like that,
Do
is to
those
try
do
and
those
cut
numbers
it
break
down.
down by region in terms of the nation? So, are there numbers in England different to those in Wales and
Do you know,
Scotland? And
that would be good to know,
because
but
obviously we have
I don't
different
know.
education systems, don't we?
Yeah, we in terms of kids missing school, we could look that up, and
Mm,
also, but in terms of young adults not entering into the job market and things, that could also be worth looking into, how the figures might be different around places.
yeah. I'm just. If anyone's noticed some noises, my wife's just come into the room and is taking I think the dog out for a walk. So that accounts for any distraction on my part. Anyway, she's now gone. Right. Well, how are we going to wrap this up, Martin?
I think we can wrap it up in terms of we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of what schools can do, I don't know that we've reached any hard and
No, and
fast
I think
conclusions.
one of the things I'd like to finish by saying is I think perhaps we can be more mindful and intentional about creating and it speaks to the attendance issue about a culture of safety and belonging that we can that especially with Autism Awareness Acceptance Month, being more acceptant and aware in our classrooms, in our schools, is a great step. So something explicitly to talk about, and the idea that inclusion isn't necessarily or just about doing more for a few children. It's about designing a better system for every child, and that small things can make big differences, and that it's easy to despair in the face of the sense of a crisis, whether it's attendance or send, but the actions that you can make as an individual do matter and will make a difference to the young people that you work with.
And perhaps things like that can reduce the number of plans needed.
Who knows? Who knows? Anyway, thanks ever so much for wasting your time once again with us. What should people do? They should subscribe, obviously, shouldn't
They
they,
should
Martin?
subscribe, hit the buttons or whatever it
And
is, that the
likes
little
and
bell, the bell button,
the
and
happy, yeah.
also we're out there on podcasts as
Podcasts.
well.
So you can download this episode or any episode and listen to it on your commute to work. And we hope you do that. And we'd love to hear from you. We'll
Oh
be
my
back.
goodness!
Well, some of you, we don't want to hear from all of you, obviously,
Oh no,
unless
we would.
we would like to hear from you all.
There's not
If you've got
there's not
any,
millions of them.
no, there's only about seven, aren't there? So if you've got any, if we've said anything which you would like to respond to, do please get in touch. Where can they get in touch, Martin?
They can get in touch on YouTube underneath
Yeah,
the
in the
the
comment section.
video. They can get in touch on, I was going to say Twitter, under It's Your
Yes.
Time You're Wasting, but it's also called X now. So
Oh,
whichever you want to call it,
whatever
they can
you
get in
want. Let's
touch there. We also have a small select Facebook group that people can also get in touch
do
there.
we? I don't currently have access to Facebook. They appear to have. I can't log in. Yeah, and we're both on Substack. People can get in touch
Oh
that
gosh,
way.
well, I'm sort of on Substack. I
Okay.
exist there, but I haven't
Do
done much.
you? Well, I'm spending a lot of time there. Anyway, yeah, get into if there's anything that you raised that we need to address, we'll do that next time. But in
Brilliant.
the meantime, until next week, thank you very much.
and goodbye.
Goodbye.